Why are refugees fleeing South Sudan at the moment, and how is this impacting host countries?
Well, as you rightly said, Penina, it's been almost 10 years of conflict in South Sudan, quite unfortunately, very soon after they got independence in 2011. And because of the dire conflict, there's been a dire humanitarian situation in the country. We're talking about chronic food insecurity. We're talking about children who've been forced to stay home because they can't go to school. A lot of damage and impact on infrastructure, and generally just the whole situation in South Sudan is quite dire. Now, couple that with what's going on the global scale in terms of COVID-19, people not being able to cover their own needs, people not being able to have livelihood opportunities, and obviously, again, impacts of climate change, where we're seeing, particularly last year, where we saw what some have described it as biblical proportions of flooding in many parts of South Sudan. Now, all this has just created a mix that has forced people to flee their country and seek asylum in neighboring countries in the region.
So what are some of the urgent needs for these South Sudan refugees?
At the moment, the most urgent needs remain food, shelter, basic services like education and health. But beyond the basic needs for refugees, there's also the need for refugees to live a dignified life in the communities that are hosting them in these countries. We are hoping that with the money that we are trying to raise, would support countries that are hosting these refugees to help them find opportunities to earn an income, for example, where they can, earn a bit of money, support themselves, and rely less on humanitarian assistance. We are also hoping that this support will help countries to better integrate South Sudanese refugees in national systems, where they're able to access social services like every other citizen of that country. And so this would also help them, for example, children who need birth registration, children who need to be reunified with their families. We also want to make sure that refugees themselves have the appropriate support to prepare their own food, to rely on themselves basically, as well as access basic services that the government provide for them.
And Faith, we know that the UN has ranked the South Sudan crisis as the largest on the continent. This crisis is unfolding at a time the world is also going through the COVID-19 pandemic. How is the pandemic affecting the humanitarian aid efforts?
As I've said, of course, the pandemic has not only touched on the humanitarian aid efforts, but it's also significantly impacted on, ordinary people's ability to provide for themselves. And just going back to the humanitarian aid efforts, we've seen countries themselves really stepping up and ensuring that refugees and IDPs, for example, internally displaced people, are equally shielded from the impacts of COVID-19. We're seeing countries like South Sudan itself, countries like Uganda, including refugees, in national vaccination campaigns, for example, opening up their countries a little bit more so that refugees are able to similarly access livelihood opportunities so that they can be able to fend for themselves and rely on themselves. So we're seeing a lot more sort of cooperation between governments and humanitarian agencies and locals themselves, really trying to shoulder and to shield themselves from the impacts of COVID-19.
Faith, thank you very much for joining us. Faith Kasina, the UNHCR spokesperson for the East, Horn of Africa and Great Lakes region, joining us via Zoom from Nairobi.